Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host and producer of the show, Olga Peters, and this is where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. And today I'm having this feeling of the gang is all here because we have regular co-host and contributor Emilie Kornheiser, one of three reps from Brattleboro, who is back from the legislative session. Yay!
So glad
Hey,
to be
Emilie.
back.
Good to see
Hi.
you. And John Walters, who's here to kind of help us with our legislative roundup now that the session has finished. And he is a journalist with the Vermont, or the head of the Vermont Political Observer, I should say, chief cook and bottle washer. Hello, John.
Everything. There's nobody else, not even a lovely intern.
No. Yes, folks, before the show, Emilie and I were telling John how we want minions in our lives. We need more minions. So anyway, glad you're both here. We're going to be talking a little bit about some of the bills that have recently crossed the governor's desk, and some he signed, some he has vetoed. And then we're also going to talk about the session. And what I'm curious about from both of you today is, Emilie, you are deep in the weeds in the session, this legislative session that just ended. And John, you're on the outside covering the legislature. And so I'm so curious to hear these different perspectives of what something looked like from the outside versus inside, and kind of the stories we can tell about those perspectives.
I love that frame for the episode, Olga. I think that's so fun.
Thank you. Well, let's start with the bills. And just so all listeners know, I will be linking to a couple things in the show notes. One is transcript from a press conference Governor Scott had about how he approaches bills and whether he signs them or vetoes them. And then also his staff keeps a running page of bills that have crossed his desk and whether he signed them, vetoed them, they passed into law without his signature, if there's any attached letters or memos. So I'll be attaching both those links in the show notes. So if you want to go and do a deeper dive into the bills, you can do that. I have to say, folks, it was interesting for me to read Scott's memo about how he approaches bills. And it was very interesting for me to hear him, because he uses vetoes a lot more than his predecessors have, and how he kind of looks at vetoes
by orders of magnitude.
Yeah, like it's a thing for him. This is a tool in his view, and that's what I found so interesting.
I want to even go like orders of magnitude. It's a tool. Like, yes, it's a tool for every governor. He uses it as probably the primary tool in his toolbox, as opposed to a tool of last resort in his toolbox.
Yes.
Well, he actually, I think in the transcript, he actually used it as a way. I wish I could find it. But I have a responsibility to take the time to weigh the good against the bad. If I can see the benefit to Vermonters come across the state, I try to find a way to get to yes. And sometimes it takes a veto, so I can finally get legislators to the table to find a compromise.
That's not how the process works.
Thank you, John.
The legislature worked for 4+ months, roughly 4 months, on all these bills. And they're going to have a one-day override session. That's not when you start working. That's not when you sit down at the table. And past governors, whether they face a legislature of the opposition or not, have been much more proactive in terms of, working with legislators on pending legislation to try to avoid veto traps. And for Phil Scott, famous, nice guy, he just, it's the old adage about, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
I also, I really, really, really don't like comparing government to sort of corporations. I don't think it's generally a useful parallel, but I just, he is also the boss, the chief executive officer of a huge organization full of many, 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 many employees who have very specific jobs to do, mission-driven jobs to do, technical jobs to do. And the legislation that we develop provides overarching guidelines and direction for them to do those jobs. And so as the representative of those employees, as their boss, he actually has an obligation to make sure that their technical knowledge, their quality of job life, all of those things are protected and supported and given voice through the legislative process. For me, when I've been a supervisor, which was not of an organization of the scale of state government, right? I've supervised, 20 people at the most probably in my life, like in one setting. But when that happens, my primary job, and even as like a legislator with some power who has staff, one of my primary jobs is to make sure that the folks who work for me's voices are heard in the organization, that their quality of life is protected, that that they are able to work with integrity. And when he does not engage him and his system and his voice as a leader in the legislative process, it does a disservice to all of the incredible knowledge and capacity of all of his employees. And that, for me, like, that's not frustrating politically. That's frustrating for me in terms of what it means for our government's ability to get stuff done, and for all of those people who we pay with our tax dollars, like going to work every day. And that's like the slow dissolving of state government that he's been doing over the last however many years he's been governor.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think what I come back to as well is conversations we've had with Meg Mott around the town meetings, and how, if you really want to have an impact on a piece of legislation or your town's budget, you need to be at that select board meeting in October before town meeting when they're actually building the budget. That's where you can have the most impact.
Mm-hmm.
By the time something reaches town meeting, yes, you can debate, yes, you can amend, but you shouldn't be debating and amending on really core parts of what you're working on. Like, you shouldn't be debating whether or not public schools should be funded, like when you show up at town meeting. If you want that debate, you have it way back in October with the school board.
Because it's too blunt an instrument
Yeah.
at that point to be making decisions about sort of what is technically possible, not technically possible, the values that you're bringing to the story, all that stuff. Yeah, I actually went to a workshop with Susan Clark at the Southern Vermont Economy Summit.
Oh, I was so bummed to miss that.
Tuesday, I think that was Tuesday. Yeah. And she talked about moving from sort of this or that thinking to yes and thinking, basically. In the context of sort of community meetings. We used the rehab of a town hall as an example. And that was the exact same conversation we had there. We talked about, like, what does it mean to sort of facilitate a policy conversation, and that Robert's rules and the veto pen are useful they're useful as a blunt force instrument at the very end of the day, but they're not actually how you get to good decisions.
Yes. John, what would you like to add?
Well, I think I should briefly note the scoreboard here, because I wrote a post about this a few days ago that, the governor is up, I believe, to 46 vetoes. The previous record holder was Howard Dean, who vetoed 21 bills in a much longer time as governor.
Mm-hmm.
The governor is, I would say, likely to veto at least 5 more bills, and maybe as many as 10 in a single session, which is a lot even for Phil Scott. And that's how out of whack this process is. And, I can't see the legislature overriding more than a couple or 3. because it's just so difficult to do override votes in a very narrow, very small window. So it's not an effective way to govern. It's a way to stop the government from working or addressing the many very serious issues that we face.
Mm-hmm. And I find that personally, just for me, frustrating because one thing we need for our government to work well is for people to believe it's going to work well.
Yes.
And to have faith in that. And when you, as I think you use the term erode, Emilie, if you erode that, people are like, oh, those folks in Montpelier, they're at it again, whatever. And you lose that community engagement.
Yeah, I know. I was talking to even sort of much more specifically, I was talking to someone in Brattleboro who's sort of a long time, very involved, strong Dem, works in a job that's also like very sort of technical and community involved. And was saying like, I am absolutely all for progressive tax policy, always have been. And if I'm working with state agencies that like absolutely can't do their jobs, it's unclear to me where you're going to be putting my tax dollars, right?
Yeah.
And so when people stop believing in institutions, right, they stop wanting to invest in them. And, you know, like, even when I first ran for office, I was like, oh, the Democrats, that's weird. And, you know, which I think is like how most Vermonters feel. Like they think political parties are awkward and weird and don't do a good enough job, and they're lost in the national, you know, divisive national rhetoric and all of that. And then I was like, you know what? I'm going to invest in existing institutions and try to improve them, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think any of us can handle what happens if we blow things up a little bit more around here. Things are blown up enough. So, but yeah, it's really hard if the institution doesn't seem strong enough to even bother rebuilding or investing in.
Yeah. John, I'd love to hear from you while I look. There is one phrase in Scott's transcript that I have heard over and over again from like family and friends, that unscientific poll of family and friends. I want to find it. So, but I'd love to hear from John while I'm looking for it.
Well, we probably have done about as much as we can on, you know, Phil Scott isn't really a good governor. But, you know, it's just the thing to me as an outside observer is the canyon between Phil Scott, the real governor, and the public perception of Phil Scott. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that the vast majority of Vermonters pay little to no attention to state politics.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the vast majority of people don't pay attention to politics, period, full stop, which is why you could successfully seat a jury to you know, sit in judgment of Donald Trump in Manhattan, of all places. Most people don't pay attention to politics. And there are precious few who pay any attention at all to Vermont politics. So these sort of like pleasant floating images go unchallenged. And there is not even a whiff of challenge in these days of greatly diminished media resources, where the press corps at the State House is just so much smaller than it used to be. There's very little in-depth reporting. The coverage of state government is basically get a quote from this side, get a quote from that side, run them together, and you know, it's Miller time. And you know, even a few, well, I mean, you know, you contrast it with the days of Peter Shumlin, where you know he screwed up some things on a massive scale, but the press was there to catch it.
Mm.
And now I don't think the press is there in numbers enough to do in-depth reporting and to serve as an echo chamber. The way that stories catch and make an impact is not because an enterprising reporter digs up something and presents it to people. It's when it starts echoing around and different media sources want to get in on the action and they all sort of like find their own spin or their own part of the story, and it reverberates and it grows.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what it takes to catch people's attention. And the media echo chamber is practically empty nowadays. You know, if one reporter writes a story, which is rare enough, that provides some insight, it's just going to go out there and, disappear in the distance. So, part of this is the state of the media not being there to do its traditional job.
Yeah. And it's interesting. So especially from down here in the Brattleboro, we have 2 local papers. That's incredible. It's an incredible opportunity. We are like rich with media resources down here. And, Digger and VPR do like pretty solid, they do cover the State House very regularly. I think particularly the work I do gets covered by both of those outlets. And the coverage of even those outlets in our 2 local papers is quite minimal.
Yeah.
And I think it comes from like, our 2 local papers are really focused on like deeply, deeply local issues. And sort of that translating, which I think was originally our mission on the show, and I think still is our mission on the show, like translating what happens up there to what that actually means for people's lives down here. That's a big disconnect. And it's left up to, I think both local papers are very, very happy to really honestly publish almost anything I send them, which is lovely and kind, and I appreciate it. But I don't have, if maybe I had, I don't have staff. I just genuinely, despite my very best, like working 80 hours a week efforts, cannot translate my work up there to down here to be sending in weekly articles. Like that's just not in it. And so like even that in a fairly rich media environment compared to many other places in the country or even other places in the state, we're still not making those connections that we need to. And that echo, like absolutely the magnification of the strong stories. I think both Digger and 7 Days have had some like pretty decent coverage of education finance issues this year. And actually VPR too. And like we really have 3 reporters in the state who have been going really deep on that issue and like to the exclusion of almost anything else in their portfolio. And it still like is only, there are a lot of Vermonters that aren't seeing that coverage for all the reasons you described, John.
Yep.
Yep. Well, and I think just for folks' general knowledge, to really be able to analyze policy well, you need to have the time to go to build what we call in journalism a beat. And that's why in bigger papers, you'll see there's someone who's an education reporter, someone who is a policy reporter, or someone who's a healthcare reporter, because you really need a strong, deep knowledge base to do a lot of the good coverage. And with papers as small as they are, everyone's a generalist, which has some wonderful things about it too, but it limits kind of how deeply you can go into anything and start catching the incongruencies when you need to.
And
I think that's part of why, sorry, go ahead, John.
Call back to what Olga said a while ago about getting involved in town governance before town meeting, months before town meeting. You're not going to see coverage of all that stuff in most local media until town meeting day. When it's kind of too late, and suddenly it's like, wake up, the town is doing something you might not like. And it's months too late to really have an effective influence on what's happening. That's just one small example. The problems are multiplied and magnified on the state level.
Yeah. So we have about 10 minutes left. So let me just go to this the kind of paragraph where I'm like, oh yeah, I've heard this around the coffee table. So again, this is from Scott's thinking about how he approaches what bills he signs and what bills he vetoes. And he's talking about unintended consequences in legislation. So this is from him. So in the same way our agencies are scrambling to keep up with the legislature's ambitions, taxpayers are getting crushed by the ever-growing costs getting put on their shoulders. Vermonters barely get a chance to catch their breath and adjust their budgets to a new expense before another is tacked on. And this is one of my biggest concerns. What can Vermonters really afford? The answer to this is different in every corner of the state. And that's why, as the governor, who represents all communities, not just a district or county, has veto power. It's the final checkpoint on behalf of the state as a whole. That just stood out to me, like I said, because I've heard it around every coffee table in many places about we have all these taxes, we can't afford them. And he, in his argument, is definitely putting it on the head of the legislature.
Which is remarkably disingenuous, and not to read from Emilie's script here, but the legislature worked really hard to try to find money to address the really serious problems we face and we need to address somehow or other. And they created some tax mechanisms that target people who have the capacity to pay more. You know, a new tax on second home sales, you know, a tax on high income earners, you know, things like that. With the exception of the school property tax situation, which is a product of a flawed system and not the product of the will of the legislature. The legislature acted, I think, really skillfully in finding sources of revenue that didn't put additional burdens on the average Vermonter or, you know, anyone aside from the very, very top level of Vermonters who, again, can afford to pay a little bit more and know they're not going to all flee the state if we impose an surcharge on, you know, top end real estate deals. If they were going to flee because of small tax increases, they would all live in New Hampshire already.
And I think that then lowers costs for the rest of us, right? Like things working lowers costs for the rest of us. And like the most obvious example, I'm getting tired of using, but I'm going to use it again, is when your road has a lot of potholes in it, you get a lot of flat tires and have to pay to repair them yourself, right? When there are not a lot of potholes, your individual expenses are much lower. And what has happened because of what is essentially a talking point rather than a governance strategy, the Scott administration has really been able to totally step away from the really tough work of governing, which requires difficult decisions that are sometimes not popular, but for which there are no other choices often in order to actually have things operate or run, right? And I think the schools is a great example of that. And so he can sit on high with his veto pen and say, that silly legislature, I'm looking out for all Vermonters. And now the legislative branch is left to govern responsibly. And I would say a huge number of my colleagues, myself included, generally thinks about the welfare of the entire state from our positions. And only in very specific instances do we think about the, you know, specifics of our districts. And it's just remarkable how someone how he has managed to cut just sort of this communications knife to always stay on the easy side of an issue. And it's irresponsible. Like that's where I am. Like, it doesn't even feel political. It feels like massively irresponsible.
John, what's your thoughts there? I think that's very fascinating, and I think you nailed it with the communications knife. I think he or his people are extremely skilled at how they frame an issue, and how he makes it over and over again, I'm looking out for the little guy, I'm looking out for the little guy. And I think, yeah, he's very skilled at that.
The little guy can't access unemployment when they get laid off from their job.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. I don't think he's skilled. I think he is unchallenged because of the dynamics of how government and media work these days. And I think he's got a very specific, very short list of talking points that he hammers over and over and over again. And that is an effective communication strategy. He keeps talking about, the tax and spend legislature, and, that some of that sticks sooner or later, even if the truth is much more nuanced than that. So it's really kind of the classic Republican playbook, the pre-Trump playbook of, criticize the Dems and pretend to be the man of the people. And it works. There's probably some like sociological, cultural, historical deep dive out there somewhere about why certain simple myths resonate so deeply in the American psyche, but most of those myths are employed by forces of conservatism in this country and in the state, and it's difficult to answer back with look, we raise taxes here and here and here, but these are all taxes that rich people are going to pay, and the proceeds are going to benefit everybody in Vermont. That's a complicated message that just doesn't stick with people.
Right. Well,
I have another delightful example. This is one of my favorites. So about governing versus communications. So the flood, massive flood, most of the state, deeply impacted communities in absolute crisis, massive personal safety challenges, economic challenges, all of those things. The governor is out on his tractor backhoe. I have no idea what the machinery is. Maybe that makes me a bad politician. He's on some sort of man machinery. I'm sorry to all the women who might ride on that machinery. And
I first learned to drive on a tractor. Just saying.
That's great.
Thank
you. Thank you. I have actually driven a tractor before. All to say, he is on some massive, shiny, large object, and he is moving earth in order to help his neighbor get through something, right? That's what he's doing. He should be running the state. We are in an absolute crisis. I'm sorry. He should be in his suit meeting with his cabinet to make plans so government can run well and meet people's needs. He should not be on whatever that piece of machinery was that looked so cute on Twitter. And yes, we all want everyone who we vote for to show up for our neighbors. And we all do, I do meals for the meal train and volunteer at the gallery walk and pick up, garbage on Green Up Day. But we're in a massive crisis. And his first instinct is to take a picture of himself, fixing someone's driveway instead of making sure the entire agency of transportation is operating properly in a state of emergency.
Yes. And I didn't know your voice could go that high, Emily.
Oh, God, I have. That was for me, that was just the example of everything terrible right now.
Big boys, big toys.
Yeah. But no, thank you, Emily. I think that is a really good example of what looks good versus what we need, which we have to go to break here on the Montpelier Happy Hour on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. But stay tuned, because when we come back, we're going to slip into the outside, inside perspectives of this session. So stay tuned. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host and producer, Olga Peters, and if you're just joining us, we have been talking about Governor Scott's use of the veto in the first half of the show. And of course, I've been speaking with Representative Emilie Kornheiser, who's the regular contributor on this show, and John Walters, the journalist behind the Vermont Political Observer website. Before we dive back in, couple housekeeping things. Hey, BCTV, thank you so much for taking the video version of our show and sharing it with other stations around Vermont. We thank you. And Emilie, what do we remind listeners of?
Well, the views and opinions expressed here on the Montpelier Happy Hour, those of the host and the guests respectively, not the station nor the platform, nor their friends, family, employers, or neighbors.
Why, thank you. And John, when we create the Montpelier Happy Hour drinking game, where each square is a different phrase from the governor, or a counterpoint to the governor, so when people hear it coming over the press conferences, they can take a shot of their like a bingo or a drinking game. What top 3 phrases would you have us put on that?
Don't drive heavy machinery after a governor's press conference. That would be dangerous to one's health to pursue that drinking game through to the end.
Unless you need to keep up on your water, in which case you could use it as, keeping hydrated with your water.
Right. There are so many, and frankly, they kind of come and go to an extent. He will use a phrase endlessly. If you really want to get hammered during a press conference, drink whenever he says again. It's a little thing, but it's a verbal tick, and once you notice it, you can't unnotice it, because again, used properly, refers to something else, something he just said, or something that was just said. And it's never that. It's just, he uses it like some people use,
Wait, can you give an example?
It's just random. It's just, if he needs to pause, he'll fill it with an again. It's strange.
Oh my God, you're right.
Well,
I of course you're right, but I can hear it now. Yes, and I actually don't listen to his press conferences all that often. I usually just read transcript notes because
they probably take all the agains out of those notes.
They do take the agains out, and I have only so many hours in my life.
So sometimes when there's a particularly befuddling passage in a press conference, not just the governor, but other people as well, I will take the time, and it's a very painful effort, but I will take the time to actually go through it bit by bit and transcribe it faithfully, and then print it as a big block of text that makes absolutely no sense. It's kind of word salad, and Scott falls into that fairly frequently, where it's just kind of random sentences strung together, and incomplete thoughts, and places where he is constantly sort of like adjusting in mid-sentence or mid-phrase to get back to a talking point. There are things that he has said over and over again since he first ran for governor. One of them is cradle to career.
Oh, right.
And I'll use that as an example here of something that actually reflects a policy that he doesn't really like to talk about in much detail. The idea behind cradle to career seems like a good one, unless you start thinking of the Matrix, where people are like plugged into pods immediately upon birth. But cradle to career sounds like, we have a plan to get people to productive lives. But what it actually means is taking the pot of money for K through 12 public education and spreading it out between preschool, early child care, K-12, and secondary education.
Or the fact that he doesn't follow through on it. So we we had this incredible early childhood bill that was is going to transform the experience of parents and caregivers, including childcare providers throughout the state. And he vetoed it. Or the fact that...
go ahead.
Or across the board, the House and the Senate Education and Finance and Ways and Means Committees were ready to do significant reform in our career technical education legislation this session. And the administration could not deliver a proposal that actually had enough detail to even be drafted into legislation. Yeah. And so after really significant studies in stakeholder engagement. And so, I mean, I absolutely think like those two ends of the public school spectrum need to be addressed. I don't think necessarily within the public school system, maybe within, I don't know, but he's not actually giving any policy attention to that idea.
He has never made a cradle to career proposal.
No.
In my opinion, the reason he hasn't is that he knows it would be politically unpalatable because it would require draining money from K through 12. And he can't come right out and say that. Just like in the current property tax debate, he did not, his only proposal for dealing with the large property tax increases that many people face is to pull out the state's credit card and borrow money against projected possible future savings, which is a terrible administrative strategy and one that he himself argues against constantly. He doesn't have any ideas.
No, and I want to be like clear the extent of the no idea. So I, from December, was in regular communication with the Agency of Education, the Department of Taxes, and the Agency of Administration to really like beg for collaboration and support. And that collaboration and support was offered and given. And no one there has any better ideas either than what we did, because it's an impossible situation. And so we did everything we could to lower those tax rates in collaboration with the offices. Definitely some policy differences there, yes. But like, there is no, he's going to veto that bill, and there is no other proposal on the table.
So I think this is a good example of something we brought up at the beginning of the show, which is outside perspectives versus inside perspectives. You know, John was sharing his observations from sitting back and watching press conferences and hearing the again and again. And Emilie sitting trying to work with different stakeholders to build policy. So I would like to hear from you first, John, when you think of the session that just ended, and we realize it is the second half of the biennium that just finished. Yep. You know, how would you characterize it? Like, what was the kind of tenor for you of this session?
Well, I would have to say disputatious in all. The final chapter of this has...
What was that word?
Yeah, I got to look that one up.
Oh, well, it's a fancy way of saying contentious or argumentative.
But what did you actually say? Disputatious?
Yeah.
Okay, like full of dispute. Okay, thank you. Sorry, continue on with your sentence. I just really didn't catch it.
No problem. You know, the final chapter in the session has not been written because there are so many bills pending possible veto and whether they will be overridden or not. This could be, in the end, an extremely productive session. Or it could be a session where the governor and the legislature couldn't find common ground. Again, from my point of view, that's the governor's fault, not the legislature's fault. But, you know, if he vetoes a bunch of bills and only a couple are overridden, then there will be a lot of failures across the board on the combined docket of the legislature and the governor, whoever is responsible for them. During the session, there were some really hard issues tackled and a lot of really good work done in the legislature. And I do not want to overshadow that by what I'm about to say, which is that the relationship between the House and the Senate was particularly toxic this year. And there were many examples where the Senate basically, you know, took a crowbar to stuff that the House worked very hard on, or just simply ignored. And, you know, I heard it, you know, quite often in Senate hearings where, you know, senators would express open contempt for what the House had done. It's just not healthy. And it's worse this year. This is a chronic condition, but it's been worse this year. It's kind of remarkable, given that it's kind of remarkable how much was accomplished this session. But the House Senate relationship is kind of at a low point, I think, right now. And I think most of the blame for that falls on the Senate.
I love
And
that.
I was just going to say, Emilie,
Thanks,
did you experience that?
And I want to say, to our listeners, the sort of ranting, raving, Scott bashing that I think was a lot of the first half of this show. It sounds like ranting and raving sometimes, and it's like in the details that matter, and those details are so hard to talk about in a way that's interesting. And so I hope that folks are sort of able to listen through for the details, because the details are like where things work and don't, and where things matter. So on the House Senate relations, so I've never played sports. I did, like when I was a kid, I did like some gymnastics and some ballet, but I was never like I mostly did like pottery and walking in the woods. I just like, I'm an only child. I don't know. And so team sports, didn't do them. And when I first got to the House, I was like a little confused about the House versus Senate dynamic. I was like, and there's like a quote from West Wing even about that kind of thing, like, about where your enemies are. And my closest relationship going into the House 6 years ago was with a senator, was with the majority leader, Becca Balint. And I met a lot of her colleagues, after hours. And so have always felt much warmer and more comfortable with the Senate than I think a lot of my colleagues do. Because frankly, the senators don't bother to learn our names, and we bother to learn their names, right? Like there's just some like basic, and like, there's a lot more.
That's an important detail.
Yeah. And there's a lot more of us, right? And like a lot of them stay longer. And so the Senate has a very different sense of time and progress than I think the House does, because so many of them have been working together for like 40 years. And so their ability to say just sort of like a hard no to something, knowing that the issue will come up next biennium and the biennium after that, and there's sort of time to get to everything.
Yeah.
And that like House members will come and go and the senators will still be there. And sort of like that frame of it all, I think is where some of the toxicity is. There's also a very strange long history of the Ways and Means chair working very directly with the Senate. That's, I think, started as sort of accidents of relationships and is now like an essential part of the functioning of the State House, which is wild. And so I think I also get a different eye for that. And I will say, like, yes, I agree with John in a lot of ways. The Senate has also not adjusted to the Zoom setting as well. And so when they talk smack about people in the committee room, I think it generally does not occur to them that people outside the room can hear or might have feelings about that. Whereas maybe House members talk about senators badly in private, right? And I don't know if that, like, that doesn't make the House better than the Senate. It's just like sort of a dynamic that plays itself out. And so like that's some of I think the Senate was grappling with change this year in a very different way than the House was. I think we grappled with a lot of our growing pains last year and not this year. And grief and change, and I don't want to give them feelings that they haven't verbalized themselves, but I think there was a lot interpersonally going on in the Senate this year that wound up with each senator being even more of an island onto themselves than they already are. And I think that also added to some of the sort of inter-chamber chaos.
I need to point out a couple of things here since I'm talking to people in southeastern Vermont. One is that this is an issue mainly with veteran senators, people who've been there for a long time. It is not true at all with Windham County's two senators.
It is not. No.
Nader Hashim and Wendy Harrison. They are not part of this destructive pattern at all. I think their ability to speak out and have an impact is limited because they are very junior senators in a body that values seniority. The other thing is I just wrote a post about the Senate looking forward. And there's some very high profile retirements happening this year. 3 committee chairs are leaving the Senate, or one has already left the Senate. This on top of 2022, when 10 senators left the chamber. When we get back in January, fully half of the Senate will have either 2 years of seniority or 0 years of seniority. And the Senate is going to, by necessity, be a very much different place. And I have no idea exactly how that's going to work out. We're getting to a point where there simply are not enough of the old guard left to hold all the positions of power. You know, you're going to have some very junior senators chairing committees in the new Senate. And the dynamic is going to change quite a bit, I think. I mean, I would never underestimate the power of senior senators to hold on to everything they can, especially given the way the Senate works. But it's going to, by necessity, be a different place in some very unpredictable ways in the new biennium.
And the House grappled with that huge turnover this biennium, right? So we sort of already did that. Also, you know, a very junior senator has been in office for 6 years, right? In the House, 6 years is considered a long tenure. And so that's also a little bit of a difference of perspective between the two bodies.
Yeah.
And I think despite that rancor, and honestly, like, you know, I think folks often look for conspiracies or patterns where there's just
personalities,
under-resourced folks doing their best that results in some chaos, right? You know, brand new committee assistants even have a lot of impact on sort of interchamber relationships, right? I think we actually managed to get some really huge, like, as you said, John, some really important bills that some of them are just like basic, really good governance bills. And some of them are like exciting, sea-changing policy bills. We got them all across the threshold with, you know, months of policy work behind them. It's just that sort of the final disagreements were hammered out in the final hours.
Yeah. I mean, I would point to climate and sort of law and judiciary as 2 areas where the House and Senate seem to be on the same page a lot of the time, but in some other areas, and particularly in areas about taxation and spending, I think there is a pretty wide gap. And taxation and spending are where the senior senators tend to have the most power. Strangely enough.
So, Emilie, same question to you. How would you characterize this session as someone who is sitting on the inside?
So it is always true that we only have our own perspectives. And I think I had, as an individual in my individual position, a particular session to the point where pretty much everywhere I went for about a month, lobbyists who I even disagree with significantly regularly, because they're would be like, "Are you okay? I know that you have a really hard plate in front of you." Not like you look like, they would usually be like, how are you always smiling given that you like have this, you know, really tough job in front of you this session? So I think my story of the session might be quite different than a lot of other House members' story of the session. But in the end, it actually, to me, feels like really incredibly successful. At the very beginning of the session, before the session started, we had sort of like a chairs retreat, House chairs with the speaker. And she sort of led with like, y'all, we can do hard things and we have to do hard things because Vermonters need us to. And I think we said that on the show, you know, with you, Olga, when Jill came on 2 weeks ago. And so for me, the session was like, we have to do hard things. Vermonters need us to. we can talk and chew gum at the same time, though it's going to be hard. And I think we did. And for me, the biggest example of that is, there was this whole absurd conversation going into the session about like, we need more housing. It should either be land use change or it should be investments in construction. And I don't know what universe caused those to be diametrically opposed to each other, but it's absurd. And we managed to actually like come out of the session, not with the scale of investments that I think are needed, and I'm going to keep on working on that, but still like a bill that was actually doing both things. And lowering costs for regular Vermonters. And so that's like, for me, it was actually just yes, chaotic. Yes, I could never be a middle school teacher, but I have been a waitress. And so my ability to sort of like scan an environment and multitask is fairly high. And there was a lot of that. There was a lot of stressed relationships. There was a lot of stressed work. I think there was a lot of stressed staff. And I think that the bills that really made it across the finish line for the most part were like the results of some like really steady, solid, comprehensive testimony and work. And that is not always true. And so I feel really, and most of them weren't even like, the compromises often even didn't feel political. They felt like policy compromises. And that, yeah, I feel, like there are things I'm disappointed didn't happen yet. And maybe I'm turning into a senator. I'm like going to try again next year, but yeah, I feel like it was a productive session. And it's okay for things to be hard.
This is true.
I have heard, and I have not heard it from a huge number of people, but I have heard it said that there are quite a few members of the House, particularly, who feel very disappointed in how things went. The number of things that either were blocked or tremendously transformed by the Senate, or things that probably will be vetoed by the governor. And there's a lot of frustration among members of the House. Do you think that's true?
I think that's always true. That's always how I feel, right? Like, there was the great minimum wage versus family medical leave battle of my first biennium, right? Why can't we do both things, right? Last year, it was childcare, family medical leave. Why can't we do both things? Vermonters need us too. I think we could have done a lot more really solid progressive tax policy than we did. And I feel really disappointed in that. I think we could have invested much more significantly in new housing development to actually really make a significant difference in how that's strangling our economy and our lives. There is some of the criminal justice reform that I think either missed the point or went too far. That was really the result of compromises between the House and the Senate. Yeah, I'm totally frustrated with the things that we didn't finish. And I think we moved sorry to be like a poli-sci geek, I think we moved the Overton window in really, really significant ways this biennium. And for me, where I am, I think that makes a difference. I think the House took really courageous stands on labor issues that they have not been able to do during my tenure. And I don't think that's gotten very much attention. The Senate has actually always been much stronger on labor issues than the House has. And this year we did like really pretty significant, incredible work to protect unions and to support unions and to grow unions. And that's incredible. And there's like little sleeper bills, John, that I think have not gotten enough attention. Like kids who grew up in foster care who are in the foster system can now access their records when they turn 18. Little thing, big win. In a normal year, that would have been like incredibly contentious and gotten a lot of headlines. Job posts, employers need to post salary ranges when they're hiring now. That's like a huge deal for gender equity, right? Like, we voted on an equal rights amendment. Like, I don't know. Like, I feel really I feel frustrated that like things didn't get all the way, but I think we see change in how we are talking and thinking about these issues. And I know, I've been doing this long enough, and I think the COVID gave me way more grounding in the arc of history. I feel Like we're making progress.
I appreciate your perspective on all of this, and I will, echo the sentiment. And I think that, the problem is that argumentation and disputes make noise and get attention. And, the quiet, steady process of lawmaking gets zero attention. So, a bill like the Foster bill going through the legislature is, kind of a minor miracle, but it happened so quietly compared to all the things that were blowing up all over the place that truly nobody noticed. And, that is generally true. Legislative bodies are designed to be difficult to get things through. It's a check and balance on making big changes too quickly. You are never going to get the whole loaf. You're always going to settle for a few slices. And considering everything that was before the legislature, and I did say this earlier, considering everything that was on your plate, a remarkable amount was accomplished this year in spite of everything.
And I'll say one thing I'm noticing about policy is it does feel like more pieces of policy are aware that we can't make things in silos, that more than one lever needs to be pulled in order to solve some of the big issues, which I think is a nice change.
It is a nice change. And I think historically we were really scared of omnibus bills because they have to go through too many committees. And so there's too many places for them to die. And I think the House this year, and I'm actually just not sure about the Senate because I didn't watch their process on this, figured out to sort of divide up jurisdiction on bills in a way that I think was sort of frustrating because we all want to touch everything, and allowed us to get things done that we wouldn't have been able to get done otherwise.
So we have just less than 5 minutes left before we need to go. What, John, do you want to leave listeners with?
Boy, I think the important takeaways are that a lot of very hard work was done this year, and Emilie's right, a lot was accomplished on a lot of fronts. I would really like people to reject the simplistic Phil Scott argument of, the irresponsible tax and spend legislature, because I think the legislature did a tremendous amount of work, again, as I said earlier, to try to find resources to meet our very real challenges, which Phil Scott is really not trying to address in any serious way. By finding places where you can get some more revenue without hurting the average Vermonter, without impacting the average Vermonter, and with having a net positive effect on the average Vermonter, because we would be improving state government and improving the services that are available to everybody. So, that would be the biggest single message I would give to people is, don't accept the simplistic narrative about what happened on taxation this year. Yes, we need to address property taxes somehow, but that is of necessity going to be a multi-year process with no immediate real solution. So, don't listen to Phil Scott.
Thanks, John. And Emilie, what do you want to leave listeners with?
I've been thinking about all of the successes we've had. So even if you look sort of at the census data, the number of new Americans we've had, and I think about sort of sleeper bills, we've done a huge amount of work across various jurisdictions on policy reform to help new Americans, folks who are new to the US. And that stuff, it makes like no headlines, frankly, often because it's very inexpensive for us to do, given the numbers we're talking about. But that's the kind of thing that makes a big difference, and is the kind of policy that actually the governor could be celebrating, right? Like one of his key talking points is about our population challenges. And we're actually making huge progress because of some really great legislation and some really hard work at the community level. And that's something that I want to make sure that we're celebrating.
Thank you. I think before we head out, what I'm sitting with is, I think sometimes when it comes to building policy or anything that's happening at like the local, the municipal or the state level, we somehow equate disagreements or arguments with that's bad. And I don't think we should, because we are meant to have a system that debates. And we're meant to have a system where ideally people with a bunch of different experiences come to the table and build policy. And I just want to remind folks that sometimes really good policy has come out of places where people don't agree when they first sit down at the table. And to just remind ourselves that to do hard things, sometimes we also have to have hard conversations. Mm-hmm. So the Montpelier Happy Hour will be back on Friday next week here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your local community radio station. In the meantime, Emilie, if people want to reach out to you, how can they do that?
Folks can go to emiliekornheiser.org and you'll get connected to all the ways to be in touch, including signing up for my newsletter.
Thank you. And John, how about you?
Well, my blog is the Vermont Political Observer, which is kind of a mouthful, but it appears online as thevpo.org. And if you do a search for the VPO, you will find me and the Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra.
As always, in good company.
You'll be able to tell us apart by, the quantity of Strauss waltzes that we do.
And of course, if you want to reach out to the Montpelier Happy Hour, you can email us at the Montpelier Happy Hour at gmail.com. Take care, everyone. Have a good weekend.